Welcome to the Global Classroom. This is the problem-based learning track. My name is Arnim Wiek.
My name is Michael Bernstein.
And we will be introducing the lecture, How Cities Change. The problem-based learning track is based on a problem-based learning framework that focuses on how do we generate solution strategies for urban sustainability problems. The framework is based on 3 different modules. The first one is when we think about solving a sustainability problem, we obviously need to understand what the sustainability problem is. We need to understand cause-effect relations within the problem so that we have a good baseline to start from. The second module is focused on potential solutions to those problems, what we call sustainability visions. What are those potential solutions is the guiding question of the second module. The third module makes the link between those 2 modules. And the guiding question is here, how will we achieve the solutions? How do we build transition strategies? What kind of skills do we need to perform those 3 different tasks we just described? We have identified a variety of competencies we would like to teach you to be capable of developing solution options to urban sustainability problems. The first skill set is related to systems thinking. Thinking systemically, thinking about cause-effect relations. That's what systems thinking is about. Futures-oriented thinking is primarily about solution options. Solution options are in the future. We need to build your capacity to think creatively, but also in a structured way about those solution options. The third element is related to values. Sustainability is a value-laden concept. It's all about trying to be capable of analyzing problems from a sustainability perspective, but also critically reflecting on solutions from a sustainability perspective. Are those solutions really sustainable? Finally, very critical capacity is strategic thinking. This is a skill that develops how you build strategies for change. Change is required to move us out of problematic situations and towards a sustainable future. Now, how do those competencies map onto the initial framework? First, for the problem state, we need systems thinking and value-oriented thinking. You need to thoroughly understand the problem from a sustainability perspective. For the potential solution options, you need systems thinking and value thinking again, but you also need to really think in a structured way about how can we accomplish this in the future. So futures thinking is an additional component here for this module. And finally, how do we make this happen? How will we achieve those solutions that requires strategic thinking? This lecture focuses on how cities change. We will walk you through a variety of different strategies for change in the cities around the world. So in this lecture, we really focus on building your strategic competence.
So in this instructional video, we're going to be talking about how cities change. So first, let's start with population. We started with population in our Sustainable Cities video, and this time we're going to take a different perspective. In 1927, there were 2 billion people on the planet, and only about 10% of them lived in cities. Today, in 2012, or in 2008, more appropriate to the slide, there were 6 billion people on the planet, and more than half of those people lived in cities. And that population in cities alone is more than 1.5 times the size of the total population in 1927. So what does that do to a city? How does that change a city? And how do the people who are in charge of a city deal with those changes? Let's think about Phoenix. In 1912, there were 5,000 people in the city of Phoenix. Today, there are more than 1.4 million people in the city of Phoenix, and you can see what that's done to the landscape. You can see the city covering the entire Valley of the Sun. Now, are cities just sponges? Is the land just a sponge for more people? And do we just take resources from the land and build the cities? Or is there a more structured way of going about this change? And then who's in charge of those changes? So in this video, we're going to continue with thinking about how those changes look in reality. So there are some strategies to change in cities. In the case of Phoenix, we've seen the strategy is growth. More people means more need for buildings and more jobs and more infrastructure, and that means it's a growth strategy. Other cities, like Detroit, for example, are shrinking. There's a decrease in population. So what does that do to the city? What does that do to communities in the city? What does that do to the infrastructure in the city? What does that do to open lots? And the other element is transformation of cities. So what is that city of tomorrow that we talked about, perhaps in the Sustainable Cities video, and how do we actually get there? Who has to make those decisions? And we're also going to talk about in this video an example of one person who was in charge of a major overhaul of New York City in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s.
The last point is very important. So we always ask the question when we think about different strategies for change, whether this is growth strategy, whether this is shrinking cities, whether this is transforming cities, we are thinking about who is responsible for this, who's driving this kind of change. Because we want to get a good sense for what kind of actors are involved in change strategies, and also for us as we are trying to build your capacity in thinking about strategies for change, what kind of alliances do we need to consider? What kind of alliances do we need to create? So this is why we picked one particular example. It's not necessarily an example we want to copy. There are a variety of controversies related to how Robert Moses induced change in New York City, and we want to critically reflect with you on this. But it is a very important example to see how people are driving change. Change is not just happening. There's very strong strategic and also tactical thinking and also tactical acting behind strategies of change.
So how does this play out in the reading? The first selection we'll have you read is about growth in Phoenix. The second selection we'll have you read is about the city of Detroit, and it's going to be actually a series of newspaper articles in the New York Times, a discussion among experts on how to deal with the decrease in population in Detroit. What does that look like? What does that do to the fabric of an American city? Is it un-American to have a city shrink, or is that an opportunity to rethink the way we have a city built?
Oh, yeah.
The last example the second to last example we'll have you read rather, is about transformation of the city. It's about examples of cities in the past. New York going through different sanitation changes, the city of Singapore going through sort of a radical transformation in the culture in the city. These different examples so you can get a sense of what processes occur for different types of change. And finally, as Arnim was discussing with Robert Moses, we're going to talk about how one man for almost 30 years, dominated the landscape of New York and changed the entire city, building 4 bridges, 5 interstates, 3 gigantic venues in the city, all almost single-handedly, and the implications of that.
What is also important is we always pick examples. We pick examples from around the world. Obviously, we have a stronger US-oriented perspective in some of our lectures, but that doesn't mean we are not, looking out for European examples or other examples from around the world too. And in particular, let's think about shrinking cities. Shrinking cities is actually a great example also for the eastern part of Germany. So the eastern part of Germany has seen also significant changes in terms of shrinking cities, and some of those cities have taken very proactive approaches to shrinking their cities. And that's again something where we need to be cautious, and we need to be very much aware of the shrinking of cities that can somewhat just happen. It's triggered through economic decline, maybe some social processes as well. But the question is then, in how far do we actively, or who is actively supporting the shrinking process, and maybe that is a healthy process for a city. So we don't want to, kind of put already a judgment on those processes we are looking into. They can be sustainable in all different versions. Growth can be sustainable for certain cities as well as shrinking. So we want to expose you to a variety of examples and a variety of ideas, but we also want to encourage you to look out for more examples.
So while you're reading, there are a couple of things we want you to think about. We want you to think about the different ways cities change. So again, this idea of growing, shrinking, transforming. We want to think about sort of building in what we talked about in the Sustainable Cities video. Are these changes socially driven? Are they technologically driven? Are they a mixture of the two forces driving change? Who is responsible for these change strategies? We give you an example of Robert Moses in New York City, but who else is responsible for the growth of Phoenix? Who's responsible for the shrinking of Detroit, rather? Is it one person? Is it multiple people? Is it the overall economic scene? Think about these things. Next, we want you to think about the strategies that people use to make change in the stories that you read about. Again, thinking about how Singapore is changing, how New York is changing in the 70s. Are these changes self-sustaining? What do they require to be kept in motion? Right, we want you to think about the cities before and after the changes. Are they sustainable before? Are they sustainable after the changes? And think again in the local context. You're in Phoenix, you're in Lüneburg. What are the different ways these changes might play out in cities that we live in?
What is critically important at this stage is, while you're working through those different questions, is to clearly or somewhat try to differentiate between what we discussed in the instructional video on sustainable cities and what is the difference between this perspective and the perspective we're taking here. There is a major difference between solutions, potential solutions to sustainability problems, what we call sustainability visions, and on the other hand, sustainability-oriented change strategies. And so you will obviously see there is quite a bit of overlap when we think about how a city might look like in the future and whether it is sustainable or not. That has a lot to do with what we discussed in the other lecture, has to do with sustainability visions. Here we are really more focusing on how is change happening, who's driving change, what kind of different change strategies are used. So don't forget to really look out for people driving change. What kind of tactics do they use? How do they overcome barriers? What kind of critical alliances do they build? Okay, bringing this back to what we started from, we want to build in this lecture your capacity in strategic thinking. That requires to assess the different ways cities change, but also identify, as I mentioned earlier, actors, the underlying strategies and tactics that drive these changes. Normative competence plays into this as well, because we want to evaluate different types of change. Think about Robert Moses and his approach to change, which was a very autocratic, top-down approach to change with somewhat ambiguous intentions, at least in part ambiguous intentions. So we want to build, again, values into these considerations and explorations, that you think about change and strategies of change from the perspective of how fair, how just are change strategies. Finally, explaining how strategies for change in cities might be different. We always are interested in taking the perspective of the global classroom, bringing it back to Phoenix, bringing it back to Lüneburg, thinking about what would be the differences, what strategies would work at those different places and why. And again, embrace the notion of sustainability whenever you can. Sustainability, and also in terms of strategies, sustainable strategies, might look quite differently around the globe, and in particular in Phoenix and Lüneburg. Well, to wrap this up, How Cities Change is a lecture that particularly focuses on strategic competence. We want to build your competence to be capable of answering the question, how will we achieve the solutions we're envisioning? We build those different competencies in our problem-based learning stream in order to really enable you to develop strong solution strategies to the urban sustainability problems you will be working on at a later stage of this course.
Thanks for watching.